In summer, the Devil's Club savages travelers through the valley forests. In winter, avalanches thunder down the mountainsides, taking everything in their paths. There are more than 400 glaciers that pour over the mountaintops, covering over 12% of the area with ice. It's easy to see why they called it Glacier National Park. Glacier National Park's steep mountains, narrow valleys, and glaciers cover an area of 1,349 square kilometers. At its heart is Rogers Pass, the main transportation corridor to the west. Its craggy peaks are comprised of metamorphic rocks, schists, gneiss, and marbles. These Selkirk Mountains are far older and much harder than the neighboring Rockies. Sandwiched between the Purcells and the Monachees in the heart of the Columbia Mountains, the towering Selkirks catch the moist Pacific air traveling from the coast. Rogers Pass gets an average of 15 meters of precipitation each year, almost 2/3 of it snow. Remote as it was, this area was not unknown to the first white explorers. Early in the 19th century, David Thompson used the nearby Columbia River as a highway around these forbidding peaks. But the river wouldn't have been any use to the CPR, even if it had been running in the right direction. What the CPR needed was a way through these mountains for trains. It wasn't until 1881 that the Europeans found out about this narrow gap through the Selkirks. The incredible thing is that 5 years after the pass was discovered, the CPR was operating a main line through this all but impenetrable wilderness, and the surrounding area had been set aside as a national park reserve. The task of finding a way through the Selkirks fell to Major A.B. Rogers, surveyor for the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Well, they had come up the Illecillewaet River, and the Illecillewaet River turns and goes off to the right there, up to the Great Glacier. And Rogers and his party continued on up to that ridge, and they looked in the northward direction, and they could see the summit of Rogers Pass, and then it was starting to dip down. Major Rogers was famous for not taking enough supplies, and they were prepared to live off the land, but in this country, there's not very much game. So in both of his expeditions, they were running short of food. And the native crew that they had feared this area, and they refused to go any further because they were afraid that the snows would catch them. So they actually turned around and they went back down the Illecillewaet River. And then the following summer, they came up from the Golden area up the Beaver Valley, and across from the Beaver Valley they found the Notch, and they just concluded that that was where the Rogers Pass was. So there was actually nobody that went through the pass prior to the railroad.
By early 1885, the railroad was ready to tackle the Selkirks. It required incredible feats of engineering, spanning large streams with high bridges. The crews cleared as they went, ever wary of fires and mudslides. But nothing had prepared them for the onslaught of snow roaring down a mountainside at speeds of up to 325 kilometers an hour. By the time the track reached the summit, 7 men had been buried in slides, and 2 had lost their lives. The line was no sooner complete than it was abandoned to the forces of winter. The following year, 31 snow sheds were built to shield the track from avalanches. In the 22-kilometer stretch of rail, 7 kilometers were covered by these protective structures. Keeping the pass open was a constant battle. Crews were always on call to clear the tracks after a slide. The rotary snowplow, a Canadian invention, seemed perfect for the job, except it could not cut through the trees and rocks which came down with the snow. Men still had to work inside the cut to clear the track of debris. On March 4, 1910, while men were clearing a slide from Cheops Mountain, Avalanche Mountain lived up to its name and attacked from the other side. 62 men died, and the railroad admitted defeat. The company decided the only way to keep this transportation corridor open was to tunnel under Mount McDonald, thereby eliminating 16 kilometers of the most hazardous railway line in the world. Rogers Pass was abandoned on December the 13th, 1916, with the opening of the Connaught Tunnel. Construction of the Trans-Canada Highway through Rogers Pass began in 1956. Opened in 1962, its concrete snowsheds, dams, and catch basins are a reminder that the mountains still thunder with rolling snow. But now the pass through Glacier National Park is monitored by one of the most advanced avalanche control programs in the world. Dave Schonsberg has a highly specialized job as head of the park's avalanche control group.
Most avalanche experts take one look at this area and cannot believe that we can operate a highway through it year-round, given the factors of snowfall and the steep, narrow valleys. Take one look and it looks like an avalanche gallery. It looks impossible to keep open year-round, and we've been able to do that consistently for almost 40 years. Most of our activities are associated with monitoring. We monitor weather, snowpack development, and avalanche activity. The combination of those factors brings us to a hazard assessment, and that means identifying potential weaknesses within that snowpack and its change over time, and how likely is the snowpack to stay on the mountain and not slide down into the valley.
The avalanches are caused by either weak layers or weak bonds between layers. You could get a layer of larger stellar crystals, for instance, and that would cause a weak layer in the pack. Also, if you have long extended periods of cold, clear temperatures, you can get what's called surface hoar. It's a solid form of dew that forms on the top of the snowpack. And when you have more snow on top of that, it's a very weak sliding layer, and that's another cause of avalanches.
The aim of avalanche control is to bring down the snow under controlled conditions before it becomes unstable and dangerous. When the data indicates avalanche hazard is high, the road is closed and a detachment of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery brings out a 105mm howitzer. It is aimed at one or more of the 200 targets high up in the mountains.
On.
And fired.
Number one, fire!
It's very important to assess the results of each individual shot. How much snow that we're bringing down has an impact on whether at the end of the shoot we can say, yes, the road is safe for traffic, or no, we're going to have to continue the closure and perhaps do some more shootings. It never fails to bring out certain feelings of awe because of the power and the destructive potential of that avalanche moving down the mountain.
Glaciers. Masses of ice symbolic of Earth's prehistory. Another time, another climate. Yet the glaciers of Glacier National Park are very much a fact of life today. A glacier is formed wherever more snow accumulates than is melted in any given year. Successive years of this accumulation, and a glacier advances. A glacier is brittle, it doesn't flow. As the ice is pushed forward away from the accumulation zone, it meets rough terrain and breaks into crevasses and seracs. The Illecillewaet Glacier is the best known in the park and estimated to be 140 meters thick. In early photographs, it came down to within 2.4 kilometers of the Glacier House Hotel. Some said the park was created to help finance the railroad by exploiting the beauty of the glaciers. Trains could not pull heavy dining cars over the steep terrain, so the passengers had to stop along route at the fine dining rooms and eventually hotels built by the CPR.
Rogers Pass was one of the first areas that the railroad really went right through the middle of the mountains.
Sid Foyts is the grandson of Edward Foyts, one of the original Swiss guides brought by the CPR to Glacier National Park each summer to guide its guests up the unconquered peaks. These men made many of the first ascents in the Selkirk Range and gave Glacier National Park the reputation for being the birthplace of North American alpinism. Guiding in the park dwindled with the closing of the Glacier House Hotel in '26, but mountaineering continues to be one of the leading attractions of Glacier National Park. Mount Sir Donald is listed as one of the 50 classic climbs in North America, and even Sid, at the age of 73, still appreciates the challenge.
I found an old set of maps and some of my dad's stuff showing the original routes up the mountain, see? The first time they were climbed, and we climbed avalanche peaks up in the pass there. And then when we got on top of that, we decided we'd just traverse them and go right around and back down the other way, which we did. And then sometime later, I was reading in one of the old guidebooks where my grandfather had done exactly the same thing. In fact, we must have followed his footprints for near all the way around and all the way right back down to the highway.
Another feature of Glacier National Park was the Nakamu Caves. Now restricted to registered cavers, they attracted a lot of attention in the early days.
The initial discovery wasn't until May 1904 by Charles Henry Deutschmann, who was prospecting and big game hunting up the valley. By the end of that year, there was quite a sensation in the local papers, and there was speculation about the size of the caves being, the largest in the world and all this sort of thing. So that by 1905, there was very strong interest in getting in, exploring, mapping, and getting the public in on tours.
Phil Whitfield is a speleologist, someone who not only explores caves, but studies them.
It's certainly one of the most interesting cave systems in Canada, partly because it's one of the most active systems. There are a lot of well-known caves that are fairly stable in terms of not very much development occurring at this time. This one is, it's changing from year to year. There are sections which the river is eroding away and the roof is falling down, and it's a very complex system, very sporting system if you're a sport caver, and it also contains these fabulous moonmilk deposits which are sort of internationally famous.
Deutschmann called them the Nakamu Caves, a Shuswap word meaning grumbling spirits. The sound of Cougar Brook rushing through the rock hallways is constant.
Just inside the gorge entrance, we can see how the cave has formed in the limestone beds. And the activity of this section of the cave is graphically illustrated down on the floor here, where we see some of the staircases, which date back to around the period of the First World War. And on top of them are huge boulders that have dropped from the ceiling.
The caves are no longer open to the general public. inexperienced spelunkers would quickly become lost in the intricate network of passages and caverns, and Deutschmann's ladders and staircases are rotting and unsafe. But registered cavers can apply for access to the third largest cave system in Canada, 5.9 kilometers of ever-changing labyrinth. There are 4 life zones that make up Glacier National Park, from the hard, seemingly lifeless peaks, through alpine meadows, the largest in southern BC, to subalpine forests on the mountainsides, and down to the cedar hemlock forests that blanket the valley bottom.
An old-growth forest has a lot to teach us. There are trees in here that are 600 and 700 years old. And this forest is so ancient and so complex. We're only just beginning to understand how complex it really is. Some of the interrelationships that are happening here between plants and other plants, and between the plants and the animals that live here. For instance, there's a plant called lichen, and here's an example of one of the different kinds of lichens, which hangs on the trees, and so it's accessible during the winter. During the winter here we have probably 8 or 10 feet of snow sitting on the ground here by the height of the winter. So any hoofed animal is not going to be able to dig food up. However, if you're a caribou, you can eat this stuff growing on the trees. Caribou have big feet like snowshoes that bear them up on the snow. There's another very interesting plant here, actually. This is devil's club. Notice I stepped over it fairly carefully because it's very thorny. It has thorns all up and down its stems, as well as on the veins on the bottoms of its leaves. And this plant is responsible for the fact that we don't have very many hikers hiking off the trails in this park, and also was written of by most of the explorers that came through here, including Major Rogers, who wrote how this stuff was pretty terrible. Many times he wished he was dead. He felt like a piece of liver being beaten up by these devil's clubs. These are quite small and inoffensive ones, but they can grow over your head.
This landscape is difficult, not only for explorers, but animals as well. The few species that do live or travel through here are of great interest to park biologists. The park is currently engaged in a multi-agency wildlife study which began with surveys of caribou populations.
In our area between Glacier and the North Columbias is the home of one of the major populations of the mountain caribou, an ecotype of woodland caribou. And there's only about 2,400 animals of the mountain ecotype of caribou in existence, and they're in the wet belt of British Columbia here. The areas inside the park and outside the park are home to about 400 of those animals.
45 collared animals will help the scientists understand the range and habitat needs of the caribou and how they are affected by outside activities.
The overall issue with forestry and these mountain caribou are that these animals eat lichen, arboreal lichen, which is a lichen that grows on trees, pretty well exclusively from mid-November right through till April. And the lichen grows most abundantly, of course, on old trees. And old trees are, of course, sought after by the forest industry. That's what they're harvesting mostly now. So we have a conflict between caribou winter food and the forest industry.
They are also studying the elusive wolverine, a small but sometimes vicious animal that scientists know very little about.
With this study, we're able to determine how far they travel, what their home ranges are, what type of habitats they're in at different times of year. The wolverine is mainly a carrion eater. They do some hunting. They have killed caribou. There's very little known about them throughout North America. We believe there isn't that many of them, and they travel over large areas and are vulnerable to trapping, highways, hunting through wide areas.
Our impact on these wild spaces may be greater than we realize, whether we come by road or by rail or on foot.
think people come here to experience the remoteness, a sense of the real wilderness. There isn't a lot of development in Glacier National Park. The glaciers and the large trees are visible right from the highway. There's a sense that, you know, immediately that you step out of your car, you're really somewhere far away from human civilization. Winter's a very special time. We get over 10 meters of snow in Rogers Pass and 15 to 20 meters of snow up on Mount Fidelity in the higher elevations. And that attracts a certain breed of people to come and experience those deep snow packs and the steep mountains. And ski mountaineering is becoming a growing interest to a lot of people. People come, they'll typically have all of their supplies that they need in their pack on their back and head into the backcountry over the glaciers for sometimes many days at a time.
Ski touring is perhaps skiing in its purest form. No lifts or tows, only skins on the bottom of their skis to give them purchase on the snow for the long climb up. And avalanche sound beacons in case they get buried.
I really enjoy being out in the woods, and of course the snow makes it all that much more fantastic, and the best part of it is being on top of a mountain. The effort you put into it kind of accentuates the value once you come to the top of the mountain and look around in the valley, especially on beautiful days. But I think one of the things you really want to be careful is that with the beauty, there's also an underlying danger. You have to have the knowledge and preparation before you can enter the area. Things like taking a shovel, a probe, having an avalanche beacon. You have to have more than just equipment, of course. You have to have the knowledge, the understanding of snow conditions. When you're skiing very steep slopes, you have to be able to understand that those slopes can give way into avalanches.
One of my personal goals has been to climb the highest peaks in the park. Last summer I managed to climb Mount Hasler, which is the highest peak in the park. It's a feeling of freedom, it's a feeling of exhilaration, and it's a personal accomplishment. And I think a lot of people that come here tend to feel that, whether they climb the highest mountain or not. Just going on some of our trails is an experience that represents a personal achievement for a lot of people, and that's what's exciting about Glacier National Park.
James B. Harkin, the first commissioner of the National Parks of Canada, set standards for the Park Service that have lasted to the present day. The philosophical bureaucrat once wrote, "Man can maim, disfigure, and weaken nature, but once he has destroyed original conditions, he can never replace them. Each citizen of Canada," he continued, "is the owner of one share of stock in our national parks. Our part," Mr. Harkin added, "is to see that the value of their holdings is kept up." From what we've seen here in Glacier National Park, the Park Service is still doing the job that Mr. Harkin envisaged, and the value of our holdings may even be rising.